I have a short-ish lecture here by John Lennox, giving us some history that brings us to the culture we have now, and ultimately showing why Christianity is not only good, but absolutely necessary for our survival. For YouTube, I'll do this in one post. For my friends on TikTok that have a much, much shorter attention span, I'll break it down into, I think, 7 pieces. Here's John Lennox.
But I'm going to start with a little bit of cultural analysis, which comes from 2 secular writers. The book, The Suicide of the West by Richard Koch and Chris Smith. Chris Smith was Tony Blair's Secretary of State for Culture and Media. And in this book, they say that there's been a collapse of Western self-confidence that has little to do with enemies and everything to do with seismic shifts in ideas and attitudes. Now, as a secular piece of writing, the interesting thing about it is the way in which they analyze the success of the West up to the point at which they are writing. The success of the West, they write, was due to 6 principal ideas. Number 1, Christianity. 2, optimism. 3, science. Economic growth, liberalism, and individualism. And they go on to say that these have suffered a century of sustained attack. And now, where cynicism, pessimism, and carelessness abound, a drift towards collective suicide is evident. And people commit suicide individually when they no longer have anything in which they can trust. So that is their analysis as secular writers. And it's quite fascinating to see how they analyze Christianity, which is their number 1 cause of the success in the West. They say that Christianity comprised 1 overarching belief and 4 practical action implications. The overarching belief was that God became man, lived, suffered, died, and rejoined the divine realm. This wonderful news, according to them, moved humankind and God together. And then that is followed by 4 action implications. What was the result of this central message? Firstly, a massive elevation of individual personal development and responsibility. Secondly, the power behind self-improvement, the startling implication that all believers could tap directly into God's love. It's very interesting when people from the outside look at Christianity and try to work out why it is so effective. And that's certainly one of the evidences. Then they say, and even become part of God, which of course is a slight misunderstanding of the central doctrine of Christianity that you were discussing just a few minutes ago, that human beings, by trusting Christ, can be born again and receive the life of God. They don't, in that sense, become part of God. They become God's children. And then an unprecedented commitment, they noticed, to the poor, the dispossessed, and the outsiders. And finally, a burning sense that conversion to Christianity made the difference between eternal happiness and, as they put it, eternal torture, although they said that they were quite unhappy with that latter phrase. But they go on and they expand on the overarching belief, as they call it, that God became man. As a result, the whole course of human history and the potential fate of everyone on earth shifted immeasurably for the better. The Logos became flesh and dwelt among us, revealing God's infinite love for human beings. Because of this single event, the eternal became historical, the divine became personal, and individual lives, even those of quite unexceptional ordinary folk, became supremely important. All men and women could access the Spirit, the divine nature. The Spirit of God could dwell within them. And that is a very striking feature of Christianity. And really, it's the way in which we should evaluate any worldview. What value does this worldview give to the human person? And Christianity is utterly unique, especially in the fact that it gives a double valuation to human beings. The first is that every human being, whatever they believe, is made in the image of God. Perhaps we don't think of that often enough. The heavens show God's glory, but they weren't made in his image. You were, which implies that you are more important than a galaxy. You, as a human being, are made in God's image. Now, this is not the place to begin to tease that out, but it is hugely important. Watching Jordan Peterson give lectures on Genesis, he came to this statement where human beings were made in the image of God, and he paused and he said, man, he said, that's the foundation of Western civilization. That's where all our values come from, and we neglect it at our peril. And that's a marvelous fixed point around which to orientate the explanatory power of the biblical worldview. But there's a second valuation, and that is the fact that Christ died for us. And the argument of John's Gospel that Jesus is God culminates in the fact that this one, the man who is God, gave his life for each one of us. And that sense of value is something that we cannot measure. And when I encounter a new worldview, which of course is rare these days, I've lived too long, I always ask this question: what is the value of a human being in your culture or your worldview? It's a very important point to be able to put to people. And the ideas, as Smith and Koch understood them, promoted personal responsibility, using Christ's power to change, helping the underdog, and saving the lost. But what has gone wrong? That's the next problem. You see, according to, again, Smith and Koch, they said because the West took science and rational investigation further than any other civilization, inspired, by the way, largely by a Christian desire to celebrate and understand God's creation, it was the first to move towards a secular society. This is high irony indeed, that the very investigation of the world, based on the belief that it was God's creation, could so be twisted and distorted into turning our society as it is now into a largely secular society. Now, how did that happen? Now, here's a brief history of it, a very brief history of it, as it is often put to us. First of all, Copernicus moved the earth from the center of creation, and then through advances in celestial mechanics, Newton in the 17th century reduced, in the opinion of some, not in Newton's opinion, God to a kind of celestial deistic clockmaker. And then Darwin removed the special status of humans as made in the image of God and demoted them in the eyes of many people to animals made by unguided natural processes. And in a sense, Nietzsche then completed the process by announcing the death of God. So science had finally demoted and banished and even buried God. And it was from there that I got the title for my first book, arguing that science had not buried God. My book is called God's Undertaker. So that's the perspective, very roughly speaking. It has to be nuanced a great deal, from the perspective of one of the major players. But there are more major players than one. There is culture, political and cultural change. Now, Melanie Phillips, whom I know, is a Jewish commentator and a columnist for the London Times, who's always well worth reading. And she says in her book, Turning the World Upside Down, The Global Battle Over God, Truth, and Politics. Here's what she says. The principal characteristic of Western modernity is freedom of thought and expression and the ability to express dissent. The 18th century Enlightenment ushered in the modern age by breaking the power of the church to control the terms of the debate and punish heresy. Church and state were separated, and a space was created for individual freedom and the toleration of differences, the essence of a liberal society. Sounds great, yet, she goes on, the French Revolution and the terror unleashed by it presented the inescapable evidence that the Enlightenment, far from consigning murderous obscurantism to the dustbin of history, contained powerful strands from the start, interesting point, that would merely secularize tyranny. Now, with communism and fascism both defeated, the West has fallen victim to a third variation on the theme of totalitarianism. Not religious or political this time, but culture. So what is cultural totalitarianism? It's rule by the subjective individual freed from all external authority and constraints. Medieval Christianity, she writes, like contemporary Islamism, stamped out dissent by killing or conversion. Western liberals do it by social and professional ostracism and legal discrimination, which I suspect some of you have already experienced. And the Grand Inquisitors are to be found within the intelligentsia, in the universities, in the media, and in the law. All attempts to include reference to God or even the vast and far-reaching Christian heritage of Europe in the EU Constitution were rejected in spite of the objection of quite a few countries when it was being set up. And the EU is now left with a constitution from which the word God is entirely absent. A situation, I am very sad to say, was strongly supported by this country. As a result, Christianity is being marginalized, and atheism is becoming the preferred belief system for many people in Europe. Hence, of course, the uncertainty, because we've lost the central anchors, the pivots on which life, morality, faith in God turned for centuries, and we're now out alone in the void. But the situation, as I see it, is even more complicated than that. Douglas Murray, in a book that excoriates the current woke mentality particularly, the West is currently assailed by its own academics. Some of them are living pretty near to this building, teaching that its own history is one of unmitigated oppression, for which it must repent. Oppression that was aided by religion, Christianity in particular. And he goes on to say, the critics of Western civilization venerate every culture so long as it's not Western. I think that's well worth thinking hard about. Douglas Murray hastens to add this: there's no doubt that terrible things have been done by religion, but two things regularly get suppressed. Firstly, that these academics have the freedom to write what they write because they have often been educated by an education system that owes its existence and freedoms to the Christian worldview. Now that's crucially important. And they ignore, suppress the fact, historically, that atheism, especially in the 20th century, has been responsible for much more violence or death than Christianity. And yet, ignoring these facts, there are powerful voices still following in the wake of the new atheists like Richard Dawkins, attempting to marginalize any public profession of religion, especially Christianity. And that's coming strongly from in the West. They do it in the name of science, aided by the Humanist Manifesto, which insists that religion must not have any impact on society as a whole, politics, economics, education, morality, or any other aspect of public life. So the implication is you must not do God in public. But it also leads to the totally erroneous idea that religion, specifically Christianity, has nothing to do with facts, only with opinions, and therefore must be actively opposed as an irrational illusion, if not a delusion. Now, I debated the late Christopher Hitchens a couple of times. He is a brother who lives in Oxford here. And Peter Hitchens, who is his brother, is a journalist. And he started off being an atheist like Christopher. But he's written a book called Rage Against God. So this is Peter Hitchens saying this. He warns that societies in history which sought to eradicate God from the lives of their people in the name of reason, science, and liberty succeeded only too well in showing that good societies need God to survive. And when you have murdered him, starved him, silenced him, denied him to the children, and erased his festivals and his memory, you have a gap which cannot indefinitely be filled by any human, nor anything made by human hands. Must we discover this over again, he says. I fear so. A new and intolerant utopianism seeks to drive out the remaining traces of Christianity. And he says the rage against God is loose and is preparing to strip the remaining altars when it is strong enough to do so.